noticed a lot of like sort of, I don't want to say like flagrant discontinuity in our narratives now, but it is kind of interesting to see how I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but back in the West Wing days, that show, which was on air during 9/11, 9/11 just didn't happen in the universe of the show. And Aaron Sorkin, who I have an eternal axe to grind with, just found new reasons to make all of his characters like really racist and Islamophobic. And I've noticed this in like, for example, the reboot of Gossip Girl that's on HBO Max now. In the very first episode, they kind of pay some lip service to COVID. As like when the kids are getting together, one of them says like, "Oh, that's what your face looks like behind that mask." And there's another student, or maybe it's one of the teachers, who says something to the effect of, you know, after a year of teaching on Zoom, this will be a breath of fresh air. So whatever it was, there's just like a couple of lines that feel extremely squeezed in there that, you know, were not part of the show's original conception, because I'm sure the show has been in development long before COVID-19 was you know, throwing everyone's plans out of whack. And I just kind of, I kind of seized on that, because while they acknowledge COVID exists or existed within their world, it is like a decidedly post-pandemic universe in which the show takes place. And I just find that kind of grimly fascinating, just that the way I was describing it to Maddy, the Culture Binge producer, before we got on air, was that there has always been this sort of burden of escapism that's put on our fantasy films, you know, whether it be Marvel or Star Wars, what have you, because those exist in decidedly individual universes. But it's just kind of weird to me as people start to produce new content, how it seems as though the sort of decision that people are making collectively is that now dramas, comedies, teen soap operas on HBO Max, all of those things will also have to kind of like shoulder this burden of escapism. And that any movie, regardless of genre at this point, although I'm sure, you know, there have already been a handful of interesting movies made that directly confront the pandemic and the surrounding circumstances thereof. But it is just kind of weird to me to think about, like, and, you know, I don't want to get too heavy, but we're getting to a point where like the real world is so grim that even like the most human of all of our stories, at least as typified by genre examples, are now having to sort of willfully ignore the you know, sober reality in which they would otherwise take place.
Yeah, it's so weird. And, you know, I think a thing I think about a lot is like how much is media, and especially like audio visual art, a matter of escapism and like a certain version of like comfort food, and how much of it is art that we expect to confront the material and psychological conditions of our current moment, and like think through things with us, or confront things about the world. And I know that a lot of my favorite cinema especially does that, like says things about the world or tries to think through things about the actual world. Sometimes it feels like it ends up being like weird, like horror films and stuff end up being the only ones that are like sort of metaphorically or sort of like allegorically dealing with things that are actually happening in the world and how bad it is, because we can't deal with it otherwise. Or, you know, in the 90s when we were, you know, when sort of like climate change was becoming a bigger part of the national narrative, you know, we had this whole string of like end of the world disaster movies, but we rarely have movies that imagine like what the world will probably actually look like in 30 years in more of like a grim realist way. And I wonder, you know, I'd love to be in the room with someone trying to like sell a movie or a TV show that deals with reality in maybe a more realist way. But yeah, I don't know. And the COVID thing, especially, I think with like climate stuff, I get mad that there's not more art that deals with that. With COVID, I think part of me initially was like, I don't want to think about this anymore. So I hope things don't make, I think we've talked about this on here before, like COVID episodes or whatever, because like, why do I want to live in that world anymore? But then I think, like, how could a show do that interestingly? I think, like, that's, like, I mentioned this in my slap, like the show Mythic Quest, I thought did a really good job of that. And in particular, the reason they did a good job of it is because their COVID episode dealt with how the mental health ramifications of loneliness and isolation are very real. And you have a character in that show who, it's not that the character gets sick with COVID. I think we all know, like, that's a very real, straightforward negative effect of getting sick like that. But we see someone kind of break down because they're just, like, alone and they're working on their computer all day doing tech stuff, and we see that isolation and alienation hit, and I thought they did that very beautifully. But yeah, I don't really know. Sarah, what do you think about this?
I like escapism. I watch film and television to escape from what I'm going through in my daily life. Like, I don't want to be reminded of the pandemic when I'm watching it TV. It bothers me. Like, either commit to it or don't. And I watched a show, Workin' Moms, I started watching just to have something while I work sometimes. And the latest season, they showed the characters, like, looking at their phone and seeing, like, a message that the country was locking down. But then that was it. There was like no other mention of the pandemic. There was nothing. It was just like, March, we get a text message that the country's locking down. And then it fast forwards to August. And so, like, things like that bother me. So I feel like just either do it or don't do it. But I prefer they don't do it. So I think there's enough going on. Like, I don't need to see it. And I don't need to process things unless it's in a way that, like Burns said, like, where they're dealing with a unique aspect of the situation. I think would be interesting to see, like, a story to tell that isn't the most well-known story or the most prevalent story.
I agree with you, Serby, that it's kind of like, do it or don't do it. And that was the thing that jumped out at me so much about the Gossip Girl example, was like, okay, you acknowledge that this thing is real, but then they have decided to just forego any ripple effects of that. All the characters' lives are totally unaffected, either economically or, just physically. They come back into a school that is completely, it's just the school. Like, there's, there aren't partitions everywhere. There are no lingering effects or knock-on effects of the pandemic. And I think that's I agree with you. If you want to make a TV show, go and make a TV show. I think audiences are savvy enough to know that drama is fiction, or, TV shows are fiction, rather. But it is just, it's just weird. It's weird to acknowledge, like, and I think Gossip Girl is an interesting example because the original run of the show, much like, I don't know, Downton Abbey was another big nighttime soap from that era that seemed like kind of a response to the recession in a weird way, where it was like, oh yeah, people have had this massive life change, and a lot of people are on their back foot financially. A lot of people's lives have been ruined, and folks just want to watch, like, pretty people in pretty places and living in the lap of luxury. And there's just this weird kind of to bring it back to the reboot, there's a weird kind of mirror example happening with this. The height of fantasy now is just having a life that is unimpeded by these sort of, accelerating disasters.
I think Serby's original point, something like either do it or don't do it. And I think that's
absolutely
a helpful way to think about this.